Mr. Neal Carter and I had been planning all the summer to make the first ascent of Wedge Mountain as soon as we could get away in the fall. Accordingly, on Saturday evening, September 8, 1923, we landed with our belongings at Rainbow Lodge, our headquarters for the ensuing fortnight. The next morning, we left half our grub at the lodge and with the rest of our belongings started out from Alta Lake. We followed the railway for 4 miles, traveled east along logging roads, then picked our way through the trees for another half mile until we finally reached Wedge Creek. The creek was much larger than we had expected, and we were lucky in finding a log on which to cross. On the creek's east side, the hill rises sharply for about 800 feet. As the bush was thick, we were very glad to have a rest when we reached the top. From there on, the ridge is a series of thickly wooded bluffs. It was along this ridge that we caught our first glimpse of Wedge Mountain since the valley floor. Continuing upwards, at about 5,000 feet elevation, the trees began thinning out and giving place to open meadows. We were nearly all in when we finally found water near 6 p.m. at the extreme limits of the timberline, and we made camp as quickly as possible. We were now in an ideal place for an attempt on Wedge Mountain and settled in for the night. Early the next morning, we continued up the ridge. However, it soon came to an end and we found quite a gap in between us and the base of the mountain. We had to descend this gap and cross a number of ridges composed of masses of loose rocks, probably moraines at one time, and then we crossed a small glacier before we got onto the climbable slopes of Wedge Mountain. We named this small glacier the Eclipse Glacier, as shortly later we had a good view of a partial eclipse of the sun. From there to the peak, another 2,000 vertical feet, we traveled over unstable talus slopes, the rocks being on average cubes of about 2 feet in thickness. The summit of the mountain is a long ridge ending in quite a sharp peak at the eastern end. It is very precipitous on 3 sides. We reached the summit at 1:15 p.m. Owing to the clearness of the atmosphere, we had a magnificent view and were able to secure some fine photographs. Immediately to the south of us was the Spearhead Range, which at this time remains practically unexplored. We were most impressed by its 7 fine glaciers along its north side, and the range's potential for future mountaineering excursions was immediately apparent. To the east of us lay a peak which we resolved should be the object of our next climb. It lay across a valley from Wedge Mountain and promised to be an enjoyable 3-day trip. We thus returned to our previous camp and prepared for our next objective.